Day 5 of the 2024 Superbet Poland Rapid and Blitz saw a thrilling finale in the race between tournament leader, the number 2 Chinese player Wei Yi, and world number 1 Magnus Carlsen. Going into today's games, the players would play 9 rounds of Blitz. Wei Yi was leading the tournament ahead of Magnus by 2.5 points. He starts off well with this win against Gukesh. After White's last move, knight c4, Wei Yi played b5 and now a6, and he just has a fantastic clamp over this position. Just a great endgame for Black, and he does end up converting this one after knight to d3, rook to f4. This was a blitz game, so at this point the players are in heavy time trouble. Time control is 5+2 for these games, but now after knight to g4, all of White's pieces are simply pinned up. King d3, rook e5, rook to d8, it's all over. Rook f1, knight takes e3, and Gukesh resigned as he's losing the piece next move. Keeping pace, however, was Magnus, who had this crazy game against Shevchenko, which started off quite nice for White, as Shevchenko sacrifices his bishop on b5. After knight takes b5, White's idea is knight to d6 check. Note that Black's king can't castle, so White has a very, very dangerous attack here. But Magnus defends this one very well. Queen c5, check, king to e7, knight to g5, rook f8. And now White makes a mistake with this move f4. A logical move looking to open up more lines, but it ends up creating weaknesses in White's position as well, as now queen e3 check is a big problem. The engine suggests rook to d2 with the idea of doubling up on the d file, and then White does have a pretty nice attack here, but of course this is hard to find. After f4, rook to b8, Magnus sets up threats of queen e3 check, followed by queen takes a3 or queen c3, creating counterplay against the White king. Queen h4 was played, but now check, king b1, queen takes f4, and Magnus just takes over on the king side here. Some nice tactics to win the game here after knight to g4, knight f5 check, queen takes f5, very nice desperado as White's queen is hanging on h6. Shevchenko countersacks the queen with queen takes f8, taking the rook with check, but nevertheless after knight f8, ef5, and now knight to f2, Black has 2 minor pieces for the rook in this position, which is already a lot of material, but Magnus immediately wins back the exchange, and after that he's going to be a piece up in this endgame. So fg, hg, and Shevchenko resigned here. Moving on to the next game, Wei Yi was actually completely lost against Keimer, who, playing White in this position, all he had to do at this point was play queen f8 check, forcing king h7, and then queen f5 check would get the queens off the board, and White is 2 pawns up. Instead, Keimer, with just a couple seconds on his clock, played the move c4, very natural, advancing the c-pawn. But check this out, Black's king is in stalemate, the pawns don't have any moves either. Wei Yi spotted this and finds the fantastic shot, queen h2 check, playing for stalemate. If king takes queen, it's a draw on the board, as Black has no legal moves. Keimer tried to get away with king f1, but we have this classic wayward queen idea. Queen g1 check, king e2, queen e1, and the players agree to a draw as White has to take the queen next move. It's going to be stalemate, and a very lucky escape from Wei Yi. But this gave Carlsen a chance to win. He wins a very nice game here against Praggnanandhaa, kind of vintage Carlsen, 2 bishops against 2 knights. He trades off the rooks here, infiltrates with the queen. Pragg makes a serious mistake with g6, taking some squares away from his knight. h6 and Black still would have been holding here, but after g6, a4, all of a sudden White's 2 bishops light up the board. Takes was played, bishop to c4, and now check, takes back, and yeah, Black's pieces here are just hanging on by a thread. Magnus picks up an important pawn on the a file, and his technique from here is very, very good. Now if queen takes knight, Black will take the bishop on e2. Instead, Magnus grabs the second pawn, bishop to b5, and now it's just 2 pawns up and completely winning position for White. So Magnus wins this one against Pragg to narrow the lead with Wei Yi, but the action continues. In this position, Wei Yi is playing against Duda, who plays queen to b5, hitting the bishop and hitting the e2 square, looking for rook e2 check. At this point, Wei Yi's only move here was bishop to c3 to hold on to the balance, but he blunders with rook takes e6, allowing queen takes b2 check. Very important intermezzo. Black wins material here as he's going to win the rook back on e6 next move. King g3, bishop takes e6, and Duda was able to convert his extra piece, dealing a very, very important blow to Wei Yi. In the meantime, Magnus continues his winning streak. Note that he won 3 games yesterday and now continues to win game after game in today's set of Blitz games. He wins this one against Noterbeck, who I believe flags on his last move, trying to get king a2 in time. Nevertheless, completely winning position here for black. Magnus is a pawn up. He can play rook c8 next move, rook to c2. D3 is going to hang at some point, and of course he has these connected passers on the king side. So another win for Magnus, who shortens the distance to Wei Yi, and that sets up a very, very critical game in this round. Magnus white against Wei Yi. He's a point behind at this point, but he does have a chance to win the game and catch Wei Yi in the standings. So he plays it pretty slowly, allows an endgame right off the bat, and basically no advantage here for white. Just typical Magnus looking for a calm position that he can play in. And sure enough, things soon go wrong for black here. After he plays a5 and a4, he kicks the knight back. And now bishop to f8, a little bit too passive here, f5, and black is doing absolutely fine. After bishop f8, though, now b4, Magnus takes advantage of this extended pawn on a4. And here Wei Yi continues to go wrong, a b3, opening up the a file for white's pieces here. This gives Magnus a very, very big advantage as he's able to infiltrate with the rook. Other rook comes in, and he doesn't play this one absolutely perfectly. The advantage kind of shifts back and forth a little bit between equality and white being better, but he essentially keeps the edge here, Magnus does, throughout the whole game. Eventually we get a single rook versus knight endgame. White at this point is just a tiny bit better due to the structure. Black's pawns here are weak. So Wei Yi has defended really, really well just to get the game up to this point. But of course the time scramble ensues, and Magnus is very, very good in these positions. He finds rook takes f5, nice move. If knight takes f5, then white wins back the rook with interest. He'll have an extra knight in the endgame because he wins due to the fork. Here, rook f6, 3 pawns each, but white's pieces here are just a little bit stronger. The structure is a little bit better, and this is where the game does get away from Wei Yi. After knight f6 check and knight to e4, white's pieces are placed beautifully. Magnus gives a check here, repeats once, and now rook to d6, and finally the position is collapsing for black. Rook to d7 check is coming, and all of black's queenside pawns are falling. So Wei does try to fight on a bit, but check, rook takes b7. It is losing a final blunder here, though. King f5, Magnus finds knight to g3 check with the winning fork, and that decides the game. So with that, Magnus catches up to Wei Yi in the standings and equalizes the score. However, the action definitely didn't stop there. Wei Yi bounces back despite 2 losses in a row. He wins this game against Anish Giri with an extra exchange, starting with the strong move queen to c7, forcing the endgame after takes, and now rook to d1. White's rooks here are just way too strong. Rook to b5, nice move, picking up the d pawn. Knight c4, he does take this one. And this endgame is essentially lost for black as the rook is just way too strong against the knight in such an open endgame. He picks up the b pawn first and eventually does convert this 3 versus 3, which is a pretty straightforward technical win. So Wei Yi takes the lead again with the win, but Magnus catches up with his own win here against Vincent Keimer in the rook endgame. At this point, Keimer does have chances for a draw if he finds this sharp move h4. Instead, he gives check, looking to take this pawn, but he does allow Magnus's king to enter and help the a pawn. And this is what it's all about in this endgame. The king makes it to a2, and white is able to pick up a couple pawns here on the king side, but it's not really going to be enough. Eventually, the rook does have to sacrifice itself for this a pawn. Right now, if rook to e1, then rook to b1 would be the response. So rook takes a2, king takes a2, and Keimer tries his best chance here with h4, but it's not enough. Black could take on h4. What Magnus does is also winning here after king a3. He just runs the king back as quickly as possible. If this pawn goes to g7, the rook will have time to come and pick it up. And in the meantime, black's king gets back into the defense. And yeah, white is just not in time to make a draw here. Good technique from Magnus as usual. He gives some checks, brings the king in, and now rook swings over, and that's it. It's all gone for white. King to h8 is the last try, looking to promote, but rook h3 check, rook to h7, and this forced resignation. Typical idea. Black is just taking the first pawn, next move, then we'll take the next pawn. And of course, king and rook against king is an easy win. Moving on to the next game, the players still tied at the top between Wei Yi and Magnus. In this one, Wei Yi gets a little bit lucky. Arjun Erigaisi here has perfectly fine position, extra pawn in fact, but miscalculates and blunders with the move queen takes a8. He was looking for this combination after rook c8 check, takes, king h7, knight to g5 check, king to h6. And if white could play knight takes f7 here with check and force the king to move, then he would be mating, as rook h8 is going to be mate on the board. But it turns out knight takes f7 is covered by the queen on b3. And so white is actually lost here. Black now has an extra queen against the rook. Rook h8 check just runs into king takes g5. Arjun tried f4, threatening mate in 2 with rook h8, followed by rook takes h7. But now knight h7, very nice defensive move found by Wei Yi. The point is that if rook h8, this looks like black is getting mated, he'll have queen e3 check, followed by queen takes f4, and the king will be able to escape via g5. So there's no mate for white in this position, and he's just completely lost. Instead, Arjun tried d5, but now black is just a queen up for a rook, and too many pawns on the board to survive this. Wei Yi did convert and win this game. Magnus, however, still trying to keep pace with a win, gets a bit lucky himself here against Duda. He's got an extra piece in the endgame, but only one pawn left. If black can manage to trade this pawn off, then that will be a very simple theoretical draw to hold. And at this point, Magnus could win with knight f3 check. For example, if king to f5, then knight h4 check, rook takes g7, and he's holding on to this h-pawn. Or if king d5 here, then white has a very nice win here with rook takes g7, rook to h1. Looks like there's no way of defending the pawn, except white has this very nice trick, rook a7, where black can't take on h5 because of the skewer on a5. White holds on to the h-pawn, keeps the extra piece, and should win comfortably. Instead, Magnus takes on g7 first, rook h1 is played, and now rook a7. So Magnus relying on the same trick, but this is a little bit different than before. Here, black's king is closer. Rook h3 check is played by Duda, very precise move. Knight f3 counter check, and now king to f5. The king doesn't have to go to d5 anymore. Here it goes to f5, and now after rook a5 check, king to g4, it looks like white is losing the pawn on h5. Magnus, with no time on the clock, just playing on the increment, plays rook a4 check, and now Duda could just go king takes h5, and he'd have a very easy theoretical draw. Rook and knight against rook. There are some tricks, but generally you don't lose it. Rook and bishop against rook, that of course is a lot trickier, and we'll have a game featuring that endgame as well. But rook and knight here, Duda should hold this one. Instead, Duda inexplicably goes king to f5 back, thinking maybe Magnus is going to repeat or something, but of course not. Magnus finds rook f4 check. The king is forced back to the e-file, and now rook h4. Magnus holds on to the h-pawn, and now it's all over. Rook g3, king f4, all of white's pieces get into position. Black is now very, very far away from getting this pawn. In fact, rook g6, rook takes, h6 is coming as well. Knight e5 check first, but Magnus picks up the pawn, and Duda resigns here as at this point the technique is quite simple. So a bit of a lucky win for Magnus as well. Duda had that draw in hand. That takes us to the next round. 3 more rounds to go here. Wei Yi draws this game against Shevchenko. He was winning at one point here in this endgame, but doesn't manage to find it. Again, seconds on the clock. This one is drawn, which actually allows Magnus to pull through and take the lead for the first time in the event after this crazy game against Gukesh. Here, playing black, Magnus has just played the move bishop to f8, and he runs into a fantastic shot spotted by Gukesh, the current challenger. Rook takes g6. Now the point is, if f takes g6, bishop takes g6 check, king e7, and f5, white's attack is just way too strong here. Bishop to g5 is an immensely powerful threat. Black is completely lost. So Magnus instead has to leave the rook on g6. He tries knight to c4. Now if Gukesh takes on c4, he can keep a big advantage here. For example, bc4, the rook drops back, f5 is coming, and black's king on e8 is in a ton of trouble. Instead, Gukesh goes for the move queen to g2, which is a fascinating move, leaving the bishop on e3 hanging with a fork. If knight takes e3, however, his idea that he calculated is to go rook takes e6 check, then bishop g6, queen to g5, and white does have enough for the attack here. Black has to go knight f6 just to not get mated. Queen takes f6. White will pick up the rook on h8. Computer says the position is equal, giving zeros, but clearly anything can happen from here. All three results very, very possible. However, Magnus doesn't take on e3. He spots a flaw in Gukesh's calculation. Knight takes e5. Just a brilliant resource here from Magnus. The point is that if white takes this knight either way with the f-pawn or the d-pawn, now black has created more squares for the king. Now he can take on e3. And at this point, the material is equal, but white's rook's hanging on g6, the queen is hanging, the rook is hanging on d1. Black is winning at least an exchange here and is going to be up a lot of material and winning. For example, if rook takes e6, black can take, the king will run away, and black has a decisive material advantage. So after knight takes e5, Gukesh does find the best move. He brings his rook back to g3 to avoid heavy material losses, but now black takes on d3 with check, takes on e3, queen takes h4, and black has ended up with an extra pawn here for Magnus, not to mention all of white's pawns here are weak. It took him some time, but eventually he does castle queenside here, and Magnus does convert this one as well. It is a decisive advantage for black. Mainly white's pawns here are way too weak. What eventually happens is we get some trades, but Magnus does win this game on the queenside, eventually opening up white's king here. I'll just take you folks through some of these moves. Of course, the players are once again relying on increments, so this was all played very, very quickly here, but eventually Magnus does manage to open up the queenside. The h-pawn also dictates some action here, and yeah, this one was just all over after king a7 with white getting mated next with rook b7 check coming. Moving on to the next round, a very critical game here between Wei Yi against Praggnanandhaa. This one went back and forth many, many times, and this is where it really got quite heated. Pragg takes the pawn on d3, which has been hanging for some time, but he makes a serious blunder, as after knight takes d3, his intended rook takes d3 runs into queen b1 check. With a nasty double attack, black wins the rook, and with it the game. So Pragg panicking, apparently c5 here is still holding for white, but good luck finding that with 5 seconds on your clock. He goes king to g2 here, but now knight e5, and it's a healthy piece up for Wei Yi. Of course, at this point, it's Wei Yi's time to panic with just seconds on his clock. It is a winning position, but it's not that easy because black has to deal with threats against the king, especially this knight on g5 is very annoying to deal with. Queen to d6 is apparently winning, but he just tries to get some moves off. Queen e8, queen d5 check, king to h8, king to g1 play, queen f8. Both players essentially trying not to flag here. They both miss many resources according to the engine. But at this point, it actually just gets very, very hard for black because the c-pawn is running up the board and white's queen and knight are positioned perfectly to support it along its way. So bishop f6, c6. And here Wei Yi, in a panic, decides to give back the piece for the pawn. He probably had to do that at some point, but now it's just a better position for white. Queen and knight against queen and bishop. King h7, another kind of panicky move. Black had to just play a5, saving the pawn, but with no time on the clock, king h7 happened, and now queen takes a6. Pragg definitely holding on to his nerves better in this game, manages to stabilize his advantage. Knight e6 here, a5, and now queen c7, very nicely spotted by Pragg, forcing the queen trade, where after takes, knight takes, the white pawn is just going to decide the game. a6, knight to b5, and best black can hope for is giving up the bishop for the pawn, and then white is just a piece up and completely winning. So Wei Yi loses a very critical game here, and this now allows Magnus to overtake the lead with a draw against Giri. This actually gives Magnus a full point lead going into the final round. As we remember, Wei Yi drew this game against Shevchenko. Magnus then wins against Gukesh to take the lead for the first time in the event, giving him a half point up. Then Wei Yi loses this game against Pragg. Magnus now takes a full point lead with this draw against Giri. That takes us to the final round where Magnus gets white against Arjun Erigaisi. He just needs a draw to clinch the tournament, and he decides to go for the very solid and trusty 4 knights variation of the Scotch game. Very, very reliable way for the pros to just take absolutely no risk with the white pieces, especially playing e4, e5. And yeah, this game was very, very solid. Arjun, however, he did have something to play for. He is still fighting for third and fourth places at this point. So he was definitely looking to win this game, but very, very hard when you're playing against Magnus Carlsen and he's trying not to lose. So this one does remain equal basically throughout the game. We have this equal endgame. At a certain point, black does have to make this exchange with bishop takes f5, and the players reach this opposite color bishop endgame. That's just very, very equal. And eventually this one is drawn, allowing Magnus to clinch the event only in the final round after just an absolutely furious comeback. But with that, Magnus Carlsen does win the Superbet Poland Rapid and Blitz and takes home the first place prize of $40,000. Just an incredible feat by Magnus, which actually included 10 straight wins, 3 from yesterday, and then 7 straight wins to start off today's action before 2 draws in the end to clinch clear first place. Wei, of course, finishes in second place behind Magnus, and third place ended up going to Jan-Krzysztof Duda. Here he won this critical final round game against Shevchenko. I'll take you folks just to the final moments here. At this point, black is actually up a piece, but after queen to e5, it is white who has the advantage. Rook takes g7 is a huge threat, followed by queen takes f5, winning back some material. King h6 was played. That's the best move, looking to unpin. Now rook takes g7 comes anyway. Queen takes g7, queen takes f5. At this point, white has a bishop and couple pawns for the rook. The problem is that black's king is weak. Queen g6 was the only move to keep the position holdable for black. Instead, h4 is played, but this allows bishop takes e4, and now white's queen and bishop are simply too strong. Takes happen in the game. Queen c7 check, king to g2, and queen e7. Final blunder by Shevchenko. He hangs mate in 1, though at this point it was completely over, as there's just too many threats in the position with queen e6, h4, the d-pawn, of course, and white's queen and bishop are just way too strong. So with this win, Duda does manage to take clear third place in the event. And with that, let's take a look at the final standings of the event. We have Magnus Carlsen in first place with 26 points, Wei in second, just a half point behind on 25.5, and Duda in third place with 19.5. Praggnanandhaa just a half point behind him on 19. Arjun Erigaisi in fifth place on 18 points. I'll show you folks the standings for the Grand Chess Tour as well after this first event. The way the tour works is that players get points for every event that they play in. There are 9 regular tour players, and as you can see from this list, a number of wildcards as well invited for each event. So that was just the first event of 5 in the Grand Chess Tour. Next up will be the Superbet Romania Classic, classical round robin event, and that starts in late June. Folks, it's been a blast recapping this event for you. Hopefully you enjoyed the videos, and until next time, take care.